Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. U.S. President Joe Biden and China's President Xi Jinping had a virtual summit, both trying to cool down tensions between the two countries. And the two leaders discussed key regional challenges, including North Korea. Will the North Korean issue be resolved through the cooperation between Washington and Beijing? Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Sung-yoon Lee, Professor of Korean Studies and Assistant Professor at the Pletscher of Law and Policy, Tufts University. Professor Lee is also a faculty associate at the program in U.S.-Japan Relations, Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, Harvard University. Olivia Enos is also with me today. Ms. Enos is Senior Policy Analyst at the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. She focuses on national security challenges and human rights issues across Asia. Welcome to the program. Good to have you both today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
President Biden and China's President Xi Jinping talked via video link at a time when the relationship between the U.S. and China continued to grow contentious. The two seem to have struck rather a conciliatory tone, although now it seems a bit changed since President Biden said the U.S. is considering a diplomatic boycott of Beijing Winter Olympics. Let me turn first to Professor Lee. What did you think about the summit overall?
Well, there is the view in international relations in the field of study that talks are always better than no talks. Largely that's true. If there is an open line of communication between two adversaries, one is better positioned to prevent misunderstanding, conflict, and war. So yes, it was a welcome development, but I would say the virtual summit meeting between the two leaders probably was a win for President Xi. Joe Biden was criticized for his rather ambiguous stand on Taiwan. China played it up as a victory. Chinese media claimed that Biden had said that he does not support Taiwan's independence. That's not exactly what President Biden said, but even the optics of the surroundings. The Roosevelt Room in the White House is a very elegant room, but it's a mid-sized conference room, whereas President Xi was ensconced in this grand, gold-gilded, red, giant hall in the Hall of the People. And she also made a veiled threat. She said the Taiwan separatists are using Americans who want to use Taiwan to contain China, and they're playing with fire, and there'll be drastic measures. If one plays with fire, he'll get burnt. That was a very thinly veiled threat at the United States. So she came across as very strong, patriotic, and President Biden, not so much.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Enos, do you think President Biden brought up this Olympic issue because he was criticized for being too soft?
I think that the Biden administration came into the summit with not particularly clear and certainly not very clearly outlined goals for what the summit was supposed to achieve. Some have said that this was just summitry for summitry's sake, talking for talking's sake. And I think if the goal or the objective was to de-escalate tensions simply through talking, I suppose that actually happened. But I don't think it's clear that they made progress on many of the important issues where there are discrepancies between the US and China, whether that's issues of trade, as Dr. Lee mentioned, over Taiwan, and then also over human rights issues. I personally was encouraged to see that concerns over what's happening in Xinjiang against Uyghurs were raised. The situation in Hong Kong came up, as well as issues in Tibet. But it's not exactly clear how important these issues were and to what extent there were practical commitments made from either side. I honestly think that talking for talking's sake cannot often do more harm than good, in particular if President Xi or Chairman Xi actually left feeling as if he had had a victory by sort of backing the Biden administration into a corner over Taiwan, or not actually moving forward. I think the rubber will really meet the road if we see the Biden administration taking the steps that they said they would and going ahead and announcing that a diplomatic boycott, which I think would be a good move for the administration to make.
From the statements that came out of both countries right after the summit, there wasn't much mention of North Korea, although Jake Sullivan, the White House National Security Advisor, said North Korea is one of the immediate challenges where the United States and China can work together. Ms. Enos, do you think this was something that could imply for possible cooperation between the two countries?
I mean, I think North Korea is always a security issue for the US to be considering. But I think in the realm of the number of issues that we have between the US and China at this particular moment, it probably ranked fairly low on the totem pole. I think the US is always looking to China in particular to actually enforce the sanctions that it gave many different administrations promises that it would. But as we know, China is often an aider and abetter for North Korea, both when it comes to North Korea's security violations as well as its human rights violations. So in my mind, this fell relatively low on the totem pole and probably isn't a big priority issue, although I'm sure that the US will continue to discuss matters, especially related to security concerns emanating from North Korea with the Chinese.
Professor Lee, do you think there's any incentive for China to cooperate on North Korean issue?
Well, of China's 14 immediate neighbors contiguously by land, only one, North Korea, is China's ally. And China is the sole ally for North Korea. And the two sides spilled a lot of blood. It's an alliance forged in blood during the Korean War. Yet, tension has been the undercurrent in the bilateral relationship over the past 70, 72 years of the bilateral relationship. But after a period of tension, I would say China has always increased aid to North Korea. China has been the adult, realizing that North Korea, as pesky as it is a strategic partner. And China went back to supporting and increasing aid to North Korea. So if your question is, can we expect China to really cooperate with the United States on denuclearizing North Korea? I don't think so. If your question is, can China actually take care of, support, and not send back North Korean escapees, refugees who enter China admittedly illegally? I don't think so. True cooperation between the US and China will come only in a regime collapse situation. As things in North Korea get out of control, as China sees North Korea and perhaps nuclear proliferation as a security threat to China's national interest, only then will there be close coordination and cooperation between the two nations. But of course, we're not anywhere near that kind of regime collapse scenario.
Then, Professor, is there any way that U.S. can press China to cooperate more?
Well, yes, there is, and that's secondary sanctions, that is fining Chinese banks and companies that are in willful violation of UN Security Council resolutions, as well as US domestic laws, sanctions, legislations. And this has proven to be very effective in getting Iran back to the negotiating table around 2010, 11, 12. The United States hit allies with huge fines. Banks in France, in Japan, Germany, Netherlands, with fines in the billions in some cases. Nothing like that, I shouldn't say nothing, but that kind of approach has not been tried against China, with the exception of ZTE, which was fined about $1 billion. So far, the United States has gone after only small fish, small local banks in Dandong, Kwangson Bank, and so on. So there's a lot more that the United States could do in exerting financial leverage against Chinese banks. And in the past, Chinese banks have been shown to behave in ways that are different from the stated government position or policy. Banks, especially big banks, and China has the world's 4 biggest banks, banks are essentially selfish. They are seeking to maximize their profit. If they are threatened with cash deprivation or being blocked out of the US financial system, they will moderate their behavior.
Ms. Enos, what's your thought on this? Do you agree with what Professor said? And do you think there is any way that can change China's stance?
I agree entirely with what Dr. Lee said. I think that it's absolutely critical that we target Chinese banks that are often the ones bankrolling and filling the private coffers of the Kim regime. I think that China's willingness to do the bidding of Pyongyang or to at least help them in any way that they can is often the reason why the regime has been able to continue with its development of its missile and weapons program. And I think that we should be looking for opportunities also to embarrass China on the international stage, not only for the ways in which it is aiding and abetting North Korea, but also for its severe human rights violations. That's why I think a diplomatic boycott, as we mentioned before, is a really great idea for the Olympics. Frankly speaking, the International Olympic Committee should never have selected China as host. They were not in any way obligated to do so. It's the most prestigious sporting event in the world, and yet they were selected as host. And so it would have been better to actually postpone the Olympics for the purposes of selecting a new rights-respecting host. But unfortunately, the Biden administration has kicked the can down the road way too far. And so the next best option is to do a diplomatic boycott. And I think in giving our justification for why we would engage in a diplomatic boycott, the Biden administration, of course, should raise the concerning human rights issues like ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghurs. Of course, the situation in Hong Kong, where freedom was entirely undermined just last year, but also the fact that China continues to engage in ongoing repatriation of North Korean defectors, sending them back to North Korea in violation of its own commitments to the UN Refugee Convention. There are many reasons to hold China accountable, and I think that would be the right next step.
I'll change the topic a little bit here, since Ms. Enos mentioned about the boycott, the possible boycott of Beijing Olympics by the U.S. Professor Lee, this news is gaining a lot of interest right now in South Korea because a lot of South Korean officials, this could affect their pursuit of the end of war declaration. What do you think?
Well, President Moon has repeatedly called for a summit meeting, on occasion even a quadrilateral four-way summit meeting in Beijing in February on the Olympic stage, featuring President Xi, of course, the host, but also President Biden and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and himself. Well, it seems very likely that President Biden will not be there for the opening ceremony, so this is a letdown for President Moon. Will Kim Jong-un be there? I'm somewhat doubtful. I don't think it's in his style to be one among many other equals, but he might send his sister, who has met President Xi several times, of course, to the opening ceremony, singing a happier melody, a different tune. But that would entail, I think, a provocation. In 2017, we saw North Korea's very serious and successful ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile test, in late November 2017 on the 29th. And then barely a month later, in his New Year's address, Kim Jong-un sang a very different tune and said he would be amenable to sending a North Korean delegation to South Korea for the Pyeongchang Olympic Games to be opened in early February, and indeed sent his sister and other high-ranking officials. So this is an occasion for North Korea to dramatically change the mood after, I guess, enhancing its net value by exporting insecurity, causing problems with a major provocation. So I would not be surprised if Kim Jong-un does resort to a major provocation like an ICBM test in the coming days or weeks, and then use the Beijing Olympic stage to, to coax all other nations to not punish North Korea and once again hope for the best.
Ms. Enos, what do you think that South Korea trying to use the venue like Olympics to reach out to North Korea?
Well, I mean, they certainly used it before during the Pyeongchang Olympics to really restart negotiations with North Korea. And I think at this point, President Moon is very worried about his reputation. He has had relatively low approval ratings, and I think one of his primary goals was to be able to move things forward in the North Korean context. And so I think he's looking for any opportunities that he possibly can. And I think, as Dr. Lee said, the end of war declaration in particular is kind of almost a last ditch effort by President Moon to have a deliverable come before the end of his time in office. So I would not be surprised if they tried to engage in Olympics diplomacy again, but I think that those efforts will be likely futile because if the Biden administration moves forward with this rumored diplomatic boycott, I think that many other countries around the globe will follow suit. I would not be surprised if you saw certain countries in the European Union doing so. And I think it would be an excellent sign of alliance solidarity if you actually saw South Korea, Japan, perhaps Australia also undertaking a diplomatic boycott and sending a clear signal that they don't endorse Beijing's threats that they pose on the values front, on the security front, and of course also on the trade front.
And meanwhile, Wendy Sherman, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, met her South Korean and Japanese counterparts in Washington, D.C., and discussed the North Korean issue, including declaring the end of the Korean War. Three of them were actually supposed to have a joint press conference, but Sherman was the only one who actually showed up. It seemed like there were some tensions between South Korea and Japan. Ms. Enos, do you think there were some agreements over the possible end of the war declaration? Because earlier the Japanese media reported that Japan is reluctant about this issue.
Well, I mean, I think that history issues were a primary source or reason for why the Japanese did not come to the table. And I think that really was one of the primary causes. However, I would understand our allies being concerned about an end of war declaration. The way that South Korea has been selling this is really to say, well, it's just a document. It doesn't have practical implications. We're still going to continue to maintain U.S. troop presence, for example. But I think that many worry that this would be sort of the beginning of the end of U.S. troop presence. And one of the main concerns is that an end of war declaration is not the same thing as a peace treaty. If we were to actually sign a peace treaty with North Korea, as was espoused during the six-party talks, that would have implications for U.S. troop presence on the peninsula, but it would also be tied to North Korea actually scaling back its own military capabilities and its own weapons programs. And an end of war declaration, as the South Koreans are proposing, really has no implications for North Korea winding down its own weapons program and the threat that it poses. And so I think this is a very concerning move.
Mm-hmm. Actually, yeah, this is anybody's guess, but Professor Lee, what do you think actually happened among the three people?
Well, here's an example of not showing up being better than actually showing up. That is, we know on the eve of this trilateral meeting in Washington among the vice or deputy foreign ministers from the US, South Korea, and Japan, South Korea's chief of the National Police Agency rode a helicopter and landed in Dokdo, the island contested between South Korea and Japan, but administered by South Korea. This was an unnecessary move. It was an unnecessary provocation. If on the eve of a high-level diplomatic meeting between Japan and South Korea, say, the Japanese head of the National Police Agency or a high-ranking cabinet member visited the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, the controversial shrine where you have 14 Class A war criminals enshrined, honored, that would be viewed as an unnecessary provocation by South Korea and China as well. So it was unfortunate, but I think beyond the Tokyo issue, Probably there was strong disagreement on the end of war declaration. Japan, we know, is opposed to it. And we also know that the United States is not really into it either, because there are consequences of an end of war declaration. No nation says we pursue a policy of war and poverty. They all say we are all pro peace and prosperity. So ending the war, peace treaties sound tantalizing. They sound good. But sometimes a peace treaty or renunciation of war leads directly to war. And in the case of North Korea, it's been North Korea's game to evict, to compel the United States to withdraw its troops from South Korea, and also to abrogate the alliance. That's what North Korea means by denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, not of North Korea. So there are risks. And a former USFK, the American commander in South Korea, General Abrams, just said at a conference in New York City that signing an end of war declaration is not risky, it's a gamble. And national policy should not be based on gambling.
My last question for today. When asked by the press if the U.S. supported the end of war declaration, Wendy Sherman said the United States is very satisfied with the consultations about the best way forward to ensure the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Professor Lee, does this give you any hint on how the U.S. is feeling about declaring the end of the war?
Well, that's appropriate for the occasion, but it's diplo-speak. It's basically meaningless verbiage, diplomatic language. In diplomacy, if one says we had a frank exchange of views, that means they were virtually shouting at each other. We had a productive meeting means there was nothing agreed upon. It was sort of a waste of time. We confirmed our respective positions. So yes, Wendy Sherman will say that discussions are very fruitful, productive, and so on. But that does not mean that the United States supports South Korea's bid to sign an end of war declaration, because again, it comes with risks. And the first will be the raison d'etre of the UN command formed by the UN Security Council in the wake of North Korea's invasion of South Korea in 1950. The UN command will come under question. It will be stripped of its legal status. And that will lead to North Korea asking for more, claiming that end of war declaration means no hostility. Why are US troops there in South Korea? So it will start a chain of events that will favor only North Korea.
And Ms. Enos, same question for you. Do you feel the US officials are very reserved in expressing what their thoughts are? Or what do you think the sentiment is in Washington?
Well, I mean, I think the US always values its allies very highly and would never want to embarrass an ally on the international stage. But I think it's highly unlikely that the US will agree to an end of war declaration, particularly at this moment. I think there's probably a lot of wait and see going on in Washington, because we know that President Moon is coming to the end of his time in office, and we don't know exactly what direction the next administration might take U.S.-South Korea relations. But I think making such a large commitment without any clarity as to whether or not this will get us any closer to denuclearizing North Korea makes this an untenable next step for the US to take. So I think it's highly unlikely that we will see progress in this way. But as Dr. Lee said, there's no need to offend an ally, I think. So respectful diplomatic speak often gets resorted to in those uncomfortable situations.
With former officials expressing caution on declaring the end of the war, it does seem like the sentiment in Washington is not exactly the same with what the officials in Seoul are saying. And the discussion on the end of war declaration is likely to continue, at least for a while. Professor Lee and Ms. Enos, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.